More Ixtal discoveries are being found that's deepening the understanding of the trait. New discoveries about the T-Hex targeting mechanics and how to counter it. An extremely underrated prismatic augment is finally being recognized, and the return of a familiar don't talk if you don't know experience with new faces. All of that and much more will be covered today as we go over what is currently going on in the TFT space. And first, let's start talking about some Ixtal discoveries. Recently, Ixtal, a very well-known top challenger player who also runs his own TFT coaching program, has talked about how Little Buddy Bot has an incredibly useful tab for Ixtal quests with filterable tables, as well as some extra info as to how they work. Now, the table itself is very useful, but Ixtal also notes a couple of important points. First off, that some quests don't require you to play Ixtal, such as buying XP, re-rolling, or having a certain HP threshold. So if you're not doing those immediately, you can actually toggle Ixtal in instead of actually having to play Ixtal onto your board during player combat. Another important point that he points out is that end of combat quests check the moment you fight against your opponent end. So for example, you can safely buy units after the snapshot when your fight ends with the earned interest quest, even if you don't actually earn that amount. And then finally, he talks about how there are some discrepancies between what some quests say and when you click on the quest tracker on your board. So this will likely be fixed very soon, but you want to make sure that you're always checking what the Ixtal quest tracker says that is on your current board to get the most accurate read as to what quests you actually have going on. The table itself over on littlebuddyBot.com/Ixtal-quests, I will link this in the description below, is incredibly useful if you are somebody who really wants to try to optimize Ixtal overall and how to actually play the line, because it is a very difficult line, with some challenger players in the past have been stating that making sure that you're picking the correct Ixtal quest per turn is one of the hardest skills to have in the current game. If you want an incredible resource as to how to actually play around Ixtal and what quests you can take for advanced players, I really recommend this video from Brosif TFT talking about how everyone misplays Ixtal, even the good players, which is an hour-long coaching session that he does alongside another top pro player, Marcel P, and they go essentially over what is going on with Ixtal, what sort of tempo you're kind of expected to play into, as well as some Ixtal quest picking practice utilizing real screenshots from top level players and their games. Again, I highly recommend checking this video out, and I'll link this in the description as well. The next thing I want to talk about today is going to be this tweet from none other than Dasic. Once again, a very well-known Twitter TFT player, and again, a very top level player over in EU West, but he did point out recently that one of the most powerful prismatic augments in set 16 is worth the wait too. It's very, very strong because there are so many positive outcomes, and he even lists all of the different ways that you can play into and his rationale as to what you can actually play and why it's good. So for example, S tier lies with Yasuo, Vi, and Nico. Mostly for obvious reason, Yasuo 3 essentially just gives you a free Yone 2, so you get to tempo into the Ionia line with a very, very strong board. Bonus points if you find the Darkened Scythe augment. Vi just allows you to preserve a lot of HP while playing the Piltover line when you get a Vi 3 super early, and you're actually able to find the T-Hex a little bit quicker because you don't necessarily need a Caitlyn 3 in order to find the T-Hex, because you could just use the Vi 3 instead in order to unlock it with 2-star upgrades. Now, Nico is probably the only one that is probably the most difficult to understand, but Nico 3 is incredibly good because you get to play around Nidalee for free, who is an incredibly strong 4-cost carry who is pretty underplayed just due to her unlock condition. Now, if you don't really know how to play around Nidalee, there was a fantastic Twitter thread made by none other than Nanande, who I believe Nanande is an SEA player or an APAC player. I'm not entirely sure what his background is, but I do know he hit rank 1 recently on his server. But he did come out with this pretty interesting Nidalee guide talking about how to actually play into Nidalee in case you find yourself in that scenario. He talks about the pros a little bit as well, talking about how you can roll a little bit earlier on 6 to stabilize, which is something that is really nice in the current meta. More items are flexible because for this composition in particular, Nidalee actually doesn't have too picky of items. You usually just want JG plus 2, usually one of those being a healing item. You also get the opportunity to flex a ton of really strong units onto your board, and this board itself can be played from a lot of different spots. Obviously, the cons include missing Nico. That means you're just gonna go 8th, because then if you never find the Nikos, then you're never getting to the Nidalee. And the comp itself is a bit more difficult to navigate and understand because mostly due to what you have to be flexing and how the tempo really works when you're re-rolling to find those Nikos. In terms of the best augments, according to Nanande, duplicators are really good, but in terms of items, he prefers quantity over quality of items. So things like Salvage Bin and TG are good to unlock Skarner. Stars Are Born is also incredible, and Calcloss is great because of those free rerolls that you use to unlock potentially Bard, but also to find some more rerolls for Nico as well. He also points out that for Ixtal, you want to try and cash out 200 because you can get full items or dupes. And if possible, you can also try to unlock Brock later on. Now, as you can tell by the loot table, the 200 cash out is super nice in this composition in particular because you're actually able to cash out quite a lot of items no matter what you do. And if you miss on the items, you get 2 dupes for free to hurry up and find that Nico 3 in order to hit the Nidalee. Now, in terms of the general game plan, he does say that you want to play Ixtal ASAP and roll for Bard in 2 2-3, but also rolling on 6 to stabilize on 3-2 with any sort of AP backliner, this usually being Milio, Ari, Zoe, or even potentially Bard. Ideally, you want to unlock Nidalee by 3-7 and play with Skarner, and then on level 8, you'll be able to try to find Nidalee 2 alongside Skarner 2 and other upgrades. Nico 3 is not technically mandatory, but it is really nice to have. Now, in terms of itemization, again, it's a lot of tempo slamming. You can be fairly flexible, but QSS, Gunblade, and AP is ideal for Nidalee. Nidalee items are flexible, and for your tanks, Nico 3 is better than Skarner 2, who is better than other 2-star 4-cost tanks, which is all, of course, better than Nico 2. And as for your backline, that's going to be your utility holder, things like Voice Stab, things like Morello. Typically, it does look like based on his match history, most of the time, you're either playing around the Seraphine backline or you're playing around the Lissandra, depending on how you go. Now, he does list quite a lot of variations inside of this thread itself, but I would say that generally speaking, the Freljord version is probably the easiest to navigate just because these are units that are not necessarily that contested, but also it's very easy to flex around the 6 units that I have on the core here on the left side. Things like Nico 3, Nidalee, and Skarner for your Ixtal core, and Lissandra, Anivia, and Sejuani in order to hold your AP utility, things like Voice Stab, things like Morello. Of course, you can always do things like Seraphine and Azir. I would argue this is a bit of a higher cap. That way you can play around units like Renekton as a potential trio carry, but you also want to flex in units that are just decent unit quality, things like your Shyvana, your Swain, and even the Brock if you manage to get to that point. Of course, there is a ton of stuff here as well, and I believe there is a complete guide here that is linked as well as a Google Doc, which you can feel free to go check this out. Again, I will link this below, but this essentially has everything that was inside the tweet, so I don't think there is too much of a necessity to look at this if you already see the tweet itself. But overall, a very, very cool line and something to look into, and again, all of this could be played around things like Worth the Wait 2. I decided that I'm not going to go through each and every one of these lines because I do think the Nico Nidalee line is probably the most confusing for most folks, but I do think that Worth the Wait again is an S tier option for sure and is underclicked by a lot of folks. But it is important to note that things like Teemo, Aphelios, and Cho'Gath are going to be your biggest low rolls for the line, but it's not necessarily unplayable. You just have to be a bit more open to what is given to you and try your best to play for placements if you happen to low roll Worth the Wait. But again, there are a ton of incredibly great options that are not necessarily that bad. And of course, if you high roll this line, it is an easy first. The next topic I want to cover today is going to be some T-Hex targeting rules posted by Water Park Tactics. Essentially, he talks about how he thinks he has found a bug that just shut down T-Hex completely and is currently about 80 to 90% sure it works, but we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But in the original tweet, he writes, number 1, the T-Hex targeting casts on current target. Number 2, looks for a line with the most amount of enemies, including the original target. Number 3, if the original target moves, the beam will follow it. Number 4, otherwise the beam will stay until all units are dead. And then number 5, bench units count as part of the beam bug, and he believes that this bug is a huge sort of revelation when it comes to the way that T-Hex is actually able to target his units. But again, he's about 80 to 90% sure, but there is some conflicting evidence going against what he claims. Now, the thread itself is very long, and there is quite a lot to read here. I don't want to go through the whole thing today just because there is a lot that's being talked about, but the main takeaway is essentially this picture. Essentially, what Waterparks, or Mocha, who's the person behind the account, is claiming is essentially saying that you can use the bench in order to try and keep the T-Hex locked in into this direction with his laser. And the big kicker about the thread is that he's claiming essentially that you put a random bench unit here so the T-Hex cannot move his beam after the Sand Soldier dies. But the problem with this theory is that it works on top of a base claim that he's not entirely sure is even true, which is the T-Hex targeting bug targeting benched units. And so Dish Soap, who is considered North America's greatest TFT player, is talking about how the T-Hex targeting rules from 1 through 4 are actually correct, but he believes that number 5 is not actually true, where the bench unit counts as part of the beam. He believes that this is not a true bug, essentially claiming that the bench thing is complete nonsense. Trust me, I watched fights for an hour, but also states that for some reason, sometimes T-Hex doesn't retarget during the ult, with everything in path dead or it's very delayed by 2 to 3 seconds, and logic below, essentially an explanation. Now, the explanation that follows is a lot, but the TLDR is essentially Dish Soap links a lot of primary sources, which if you want, I will link these down in the description below if you want to check out how the targeting actually looks. But he's essentially saying that from what he watches, the bench doesn't actually affect the T-Hex ult at all, but there is something else causing a 2 to 3 second delay of ulting nothing after killing everything in the main path. But from what he's seen, it's not consistent at all, so it's very difficult to actually understand what is causing the T-Hex to ult in this manner. It's very difficult to understand why exactly this is working the way that it does, and so far the mystery still remains unsolved. Based off these clips alone, you can kind of tell that like the bench does not really play a large factor into the way that the T-Hex retargets. It does seem to be incredibly inconsistent the more you watch some of these fights. I'm sure that if anybody has any leads on how the T-Hex targeting actually works, I'm sure the competitive TFT community would love to hear about it. Now that being said, what can we take away from all of this? Well, number one, the anti-T-Hex positioning tech that we covered a little while back still works and is very much true and consistent. This is a great way in order for you to anti-T-Hex if your opponent is not paying a lot of attention. But again, the only problem is that the more people know about this, the easier it is to reposition against it, because the T-Hex could just be moved over onto the other side, and then as a person who's trying to anti-T-Hex, you're going to have a very difficult time. I think an underappreciated tip actually comes from Kim as well, talking about how T-Hex player only has to move 2 to 3 units, so simpler ways to put Skarner in front of Dino, which I think is an incredibly good take. By putting Skarner in either A1 or an A7 right in front of the T-Hex, the Skarner ulti will actually cause the T-Hex to come clump inwards and then redirect the beam away from your carry. Now, of course, there's only 2 more days of this patch until we get the huge patch coming up for the second patch of the set, so if you don't want to be thinking about this anymore because T-Hex is likely getting nerfed, then I wouldn't worry too much about it. But now moving on to the next topic, let's talk about the Rolldown Rankings. This is essentially a TFT podcast ran by CLE and Gangly, who are very well-known casters inside of the TFT community, where they're trying to recreate that magic of don't talk if you don't know. Now, obviously, if you don't know what I'm talking about, essentially, back all the way up until set 13, Frodan and Bryce Blum, or Esports Law, were doing a duo podcast series that was incredibly popular around the TFT esports space. A lot of top pro players, as well as players who are familiar with the competitive scene, would all tune in almost every single week watching Dan and Bryce's podcast. But unfortunately, the podcast itself was retired, and we haven't seen anything similar come out since. With that being said, Gangly and CLE have come out with the Rolldown, which is their own version of a TFT esports podcast, and in their most recent podcast, they actually did a whole ranking of the top of NA. I think if you're trying to learn more about the competitive scene, this is one of the best ways to learn about the esports, so I highly recommend checking it out. But with that, I wanted to end today on a little bit of a celebratory note and talk about 2 players in particular in their ranked journeys. The first one being 149CM, who actually did an incredible run from Masters all the way to Challenger in a single sitting. In case you didn't know, the ranked leaderboards actually refresh at 3 a.m. Eastern every single day. This means that if you're at the threshold to hit Challenger, then at 3 a.m. Eastern, your rank will change at that time. Essentially, what this guy did was he went from being Masters and then climbed so high up that he skipped Grandmasters, then got into Challenger before the leaderboard could refresh itself. This, of course, is incredibly impressive, and I thought it was definitely something worth shouting out. And finally, a very unexpected face is Forrest. In case you don't know, this is also a very well-known Twitter guy in the League of Legends space, but apparently is incredibly addicted to playing some TFT. Now, I don't actually know his in-game name, but he does seem to be climbing incredibly fast for somebody who doesn't seem to be incredibly involved in the TFT space. But still, this was incredibly surprising to see, and I think he is doing a fantastic job going up through the ranks. But with that, that is basically all that I have for today. If you have any stories or any sources you want me to be checking when I do these episodes, please leave them in the comments below. And if you think I'm missing out on any stories, I'd love to hear about those as well. Finally, just based on the comments recently on all of these episodes, the reception seems to be incredibly positive. So thank you guys so much for your support, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Take care, guys. Happy climbing.